They said the well was dry until it choked on chains. Tucked in the pines of western Massachusetts, Sacred Heart Asylum stood for 121 years. It was closed in silence, with no final sermon, no official cause. In 2019, workers restoring the rear grounds made a discovery: a capped stone well hidden beneath soil and rosary beads. When they opened it, they found 32 rosaries, all tangled, all burned. None belonged to the staff. None were ever logged, and not a single one had a crucifix. The road that leads to Sacred Heart bends sharply through pine trees. Gravel whispers beneath the wheels, but the trees make no sound. Fog collected at the base of the wrought iron gates that were welded shut in 1962, then reopened once briefly. For documentation in 2003, the building stands 3 stories tall, pale brick, streaked with lichen and rust. Windows too narrow for sunlight. Above the archway, a Latin inscription, nearly illegible from weathering. But if you trace it carefully, you can still read: Domus Cordis, Custos Animae, House of the Heart, Keeper of the Soul. It was built in 1898. Sacred Heart Asylum was established under the Diocese of Boston as a quiet recovery institution for orphaned or abandoned children believed to be suffering from spiritual malaise, a phrase used in church records to describe everything from grief to hallucinations. Its original mission was simple: offer structure, safety, and solitude to children who had lost both home and faith. But not every faith is safe to return to. The asylum was staffed by 6 Sisters of St. Dymphna, a reclusive order known for their vow of silence. They wore plain wool habits and carried rosaries with dark wooden beads. They also carried small black journals. Each one wrote her observations in the same looping script, but only one of those journals survived. Inside, there's a line repeated again and again across the pages: to teach them silence, we must first hear their prayers. There are no hymns listed in the asylum's early records, no music program, no choir. The chapel had no organ. One of the boys sent there in 1901, name redacted, wrote to Zan a single postcard: "It's not quiet here, it's waiting." Children at Sacred Heart followed a rigid daily structure: waking at 4:45 a.m., cold wash, kneeling prayer for 32 minutes, then silence. Meals were eaten without speech. Discipline was immediate but never violent. Punishments were contemplative. If a child disobeyed, they were sent to the oratory. No logs exist of what happened in the oratory, only that the average duration was 3 hours. The building's design was drawn up by a Belgian architect known for abbey reconstructions. His sketches still exist: intricate layouts of prayer corridors, cloisters, and underground crawlways. But one wing appears in final construction that wasn't in his drafts: a narrow eastern hall with no windows, connected to nothing. He later refused payment. His letter to the diocese ends with one line: "I gave you stone, but you placed something else inside it." The first bishop to visit after opening was from Providence, Bishop Alaric Mead, a quiet man known for his devotion to monastic solitude. He came unannounced, stayed 2 nights, then left without giving Mass. His report to the Archdiocese was 1 page long. The only sentence under the heading Atmosphere read: "A place that prays without breath." In 1903, a mother tried to visit her son. She had remarried and hoped to reclaim custody. She sent letters, got no reply. When she arrived, she was told there was no record of the boy, no admission log, no belongings, no name on the rolls. She returned twice more. On her last visit, she left a note with the groundskeeper. It was never sent to the bishop. It was found decades later, folded inside a hymnal. She wrote, "I heard him humming from the chapel, even as they told me he wasn't there." Enrollment remained low, never more than 30 children at once. Some were referred by parish priests, others by hospitals. A few simply arrived, left on the gates with no names. The sisters accepted them all, but they did not baptize them. No baptismal records exist for any child taken into Sacred Heart after 1904. That same year, the baptismal font in the chapel was removed. No one knows where it went. Local children called it the nun house. They made dares, threw stones at the fence. Some claimed they saw figures in the third-floor window, not moving, just watching. One boy later said, "The curtains blinked." He never went back. The grounds were always kept immaculate, pine needles swept, gravel paths lined with small white stones. But the well behind the east wing was always sealed, covered in slats, chained, and prayed over. An old groundskeeper, interviewed anonymously in 1978, said the well was never to be opened. He said the sisters had a phrase for it: "Don't wake the rosary." He thought it was nonsense, a superstition, until one night he heard something tapping beneath the stones, a slow rhythmic sound, like beads falling. He quit the next day, didn't collect his final pay, didn't come back for his coat, and on his resignation form, where it said reason for leaving, he wrote, "They weren't praying, they were remembering." That form was never filed. It was found years later, tucked into a wall cavity during restoration, folded around a single black bead, and that's when they realized the rosaries didn't stay inside. The east wing was quietest in the mornings. Long corridors stretched behind the chapel, dimly lit by narrow amber-tinted windows that never opened. Even in summer, the air was still cold there, dense with scent that didn't quite match the rest of the asylum. Not mold, not incense, something older. In 1904, two sisters from St. Dimphna's order arrived without announcement. They came not by cart, but on foot, traveling through the pines at dawn. No one knows who sent them. No letters, no records. They brought only one crate. Inside were wooden bead blanks, thin wire and crucifix molds. The new wing was built in silence. It was called the Oratorium Rosy, the Rosary Room. Unlike the rest of Sacred Heart, it had no beds, no desks, just one long table, worn smooth along its edges, and rows of kneelers facing a blank wall. There was no iconography, no images of Christ, only a niche carved into the wall where sunlight never reached. Every child in the asylum, whether 6 or 16, was required to spend 1 hour each day in the oratorium. No exceptions. They were told to make their own rosary. Beads were counted carefully, 59 per child. If one was dropped or cracked, the sister supervising would slide a replacement across the table, without a word. Each child was told, "This is your prayer. It must come from your hands." Some of the younger children struggled with the wire loops, but the sisters never helped. If a child asked, the beadwork was taken apart. They were told to begin again. One boy, William, age 9, attempted to tie his using twine from his shoes. His rosary was taken and burned. A thin soot line remained on the tabletop for years. The chapel ledger from that year still exists, stored in the diocesan archive in a sealed file marked Irregular Sacramentals. The entries are methodical, 1 page per child, date of arrival, daily prayer log, rosary completion date, 31 names, each followed by the word, bound. But only 29 children were admitted that year. Their names can be cross-referenced with the asylum intake log, each accounted for, each with a bed, an origin parish, a medical file. The last 2 names have no correlating records, no birth dates, no notes, no bed assignments. The ink is darker as though written later. The handwriting slightly different. One is listed only as Elisheva, the other D, withheld. In the margins, one note, barely visible under ultraviolet light, reads, 3 slept beneath. 1 never slept at all. No context is given. In the far corner of the oratorium, behind a shelf of unused molds, was a trapdoor sealed in iron. No hinges, no handle, just a faint outline of a cross carved into its surface, worn smooth at the edges. It does not appear on the architect's blueprint. In 1996, during structural inspections, a contractor attempted to pry it open. His crowbar snapped. The metal edge sheared cleanly in 2. The floor beneath remained untouched. Sister Magdalena, the last surviving member of the original order, once spoke of the Rosary Room in a recorded interview. She was 104 years old, her voice fragile but clear. When asked why the children made the rosaries themselves, she paused, then whispered, because they were bearing what they couldn't confess. Only one rosary from Sacred Heart survives. It was found in a rusted tin in the attic rafters during a roof repair. The beads are slightly irregular, not wood, but something else, chalky and pale like bone that's been soaked. The crucifix is missing. In its place is a knotted string, looped back into itself, a circle that tightens. Tucked inside the tin was a folded parchment. No name, just a single line in Latin, Oro Uti Tacit. I pray that it stays quiet. The sisters never taught Latin. In 1911, 3 rosaries were removed from the oratorium inventory. No explanation. When asked, the superior sister at the time replied, "Some prayers take root. If we leave them too long, they bloom." She died 1 week later, cause listed as sudden illness. No autopsy was performed. The children stopped using the oratorium by 1915. The practice was ended quietly. The table was removed. The kneelers stacked in the cellar, but the door was never locked. Visitors in later years would often note the temperature difference. The rest of the asylum might be warm, even stifling in summer, but the oratorium stayed cold, consistently, unnaturally. One archivist, during a survey in 1983, left her tape recorder running on the floor overnight. The tape plays back 3 hours of silence. Then, softly, almost inaudible, a small rhythmic sound, like beads, sliding across wood. 1, pause, 1, pause, 31 times. And then a whisper, so faint it cracks the tape. Mine was never counted. No children had entered the building in over 40 years. The recorder was found still running, but the tape had stopped turning. It had jammed, because something inside it had melted, not from heat, but from pressure, the kind you feel in confession, right before you speak, right before something answers. The well was always there, behind the east wing, tucked into the slope beneath the pines. Children were told never to go near it. It was covered with rotting wood, nailed in an uneven cross. Coiled chains circled its mouth like a brace, bound tight, rusted shut. They said it hadn't held water in 60 years. But Eli didn't believe that. He said it was still full, not with water, but with sound. Eli arrived in winter, 1907, 7 years old, thin, left-handed, no known family. He didn't speak at first, not for 2 weeks. The sisters assumed it was trauma, common in children sent to Sacred Heart. They gave him space. Routine, quiet. He adapted to the silence faster than most. But he never closed his eyes during prayer, never knelt unless watched. He refused to sit facing the chapel's east wall, the one nearest the oratorium. He'd shift subtly, always angling his body west, toward the woods. One sister noted he hummed constantly under his breath, the same low pattern, 7 tones, repeating, never louder than breath. It wasn't music. It sounded like remembering. Sister Dominica was the first to notice his drawings. They used chalk once a week for silent reflection. Most children scribbled trees, shapes, letters. A few copied crucifixes from the chapel walls. Eli didn't. He drew saints. Dozens, sometimes in robes, sometimes in ash, but never with eyes. Some had blank ovals. Others had thorns twisted through the sockets. One was sketched in such fine black lines that when the light hit it, it shimmered like it was weeping. He never explained the images, never claimed credit, but his name was carved into the side of one slate, the same slate where someone, possibly him, had etched a single phrase, "He sees them now." When asked to draw the Virgin Mary, Eli refused. He snapped the chalk in two, not with anger, deliberate, slow, then placed the pieces beneath the window and walked away. He wouldn't say why. Later that evening, he was caught slipping a sliver of chalk into the hem of his sleeve. When the sister pulled it free, she saw what was written on it. "She isn't looking at you." Eli rarely cried, never screamed, but there was one day in early spring when the sisters heard him shouting in the yard. They found him on his knees, just a few yards from the well, hands over his ears, mouthing something. When they reached him, he stopped moving, wouldn't speak, wouldn't blink. He was carried inside, placed in the infirmary. That night, he wet the sheets and curled into the corner, facing the wall. The next morning, he'd drawn another figure, this one kneeling beside the well. The chain was broken. The figure had no face, only beads strung like tears down its chest. That drawing was not archived. It was burned, but a surviving sister later redrew it from memory for a visiting diocesan psychologist. She cried while sketching, said she could still hear the humming when she remembered it. In the chapel, Eli always chose the same pew, back row, left side. His fingers traced the underside of the wood, as though counting notches no one else could see. Sister Dominica tried to correct him once, urged him to kneel during the second sorrowful mystery. He didn't move. He whispered something under his breath. It wasn't a prayer. It was a question. How many are left? That night, he vanished. For 3 hours, the entire asylum was searched. His bed empty, the chapel locked, the oratorium sealed. It was past midnight when they found him, curled beside the broken statue of St. Jude, the patron of lost causes. The statue's eyes had crumbled off. Small piles of white dust circled his feet like offerings. Eli lay in fetal position, lips moving in sleep. When a sister knelt beside him, she said she could feel the warmth of breath, but the words made no sense. They weren't Latin. They weren't English, but they sounded like prayer, soft, rhythmic, counting. She described it as a language that knew you. They let him sleep in the chapel until morning. When he woke, he had no memory of it. He simply asked if the well had been opened. No one answered. From that day forward, he spoke less, drew more. One slate was found hidden beneath his mattress. A figure stood on the chapel roof, arms out, rosary wrapped around its neck like a garrote. Next to it, Eli had written, "She prayed so hard, she turned inside out." When Sister Dominica confronted him, he just smiled, a soft, hollow kind of smile, then looked past her, toward the east wall, and said, "It's almost time for number 32. There were only 29 children at Sacred Heart that year. They checked, twice. They counted every name, every bed, every rosary. And then they realized one of the crucifixes was missing, not broken, not lost, removed, its place on the chain replaced by a perfect circle, a loop, not tied backward. The same kind Eli wore on his wrist, braided in his own hair. When asked why, he finally answered, "So it knows where I am." He never drew again. He spent his days in silence, staring out the chapel window that didn't face anything, just the woods and the slope and what waited beneath the well. It begins with absence, a missing sock, a toothbrush no longer damp, a name unspoken during roll call, met with silence instead of surprise. By 1912, 5 children had vanished from Sacred Heart. None were taken. None were released. Each case was filed the same way, voluntary departure, no further inquiry. But the truth didn't disappear so easily. Children don't run away barefoot, not in January, not through miles of pine and frostbitten silence, and certainly not without leaving the door open. The first was a girl, Clara, age 10. She had drawn bees in her margins, wore her rosary like a crown during reflection hour. She was last seen the morning after an unexpected frost. Her bed perfectly made, her drawer untouched, her prayer log open to a blank page. On the windowsill, one bead, blackened at the edges like it had been burned. She had asked a week prior if she could pray by the well, said she wanted to listen like the sisters do. They told her no, but that night, someone saw her standing out there, alone and smiling. 2 nights later, she was gone. Then it happened again, and again. By spring, the other children had stopped asking questions. They moved quieter, ate slower, prayed longer, because the well had started whispering. At first, it was a trick of the wind. That's what the sisters said. Air catching the chains or the old slats creaking in the cold. But children know the difference between wind and breath. One boy claimed it said his name 3 times. Another said it just wept. One wrote a full sentence into the margin of his catechism. The prayers come back wrong. When asked to explain, he started sobbing, not loud, but like someone grieving something still alive. The sisters investigated once. It was a cloudless dusk, the air brittle, still. They walked together, 3 of them, to the back slope behind the east wing. The well stood crooked now, the wood cover warped, chains damp even without rain. One sister placed her ear to the slats. Another took out her rosary. They waited for a minute, then 5, then nearly 10. And then very softly, they heard it, a prayer, not in any language they knew, not whispered by a child, not echoing from below, but pressed against their thoughts, like it was remembering through them. One sister collapsed. Another vomited. The third simply turned away. They never spoke of it again, not in confession, not in writing. The well was sealed tighter. Crosses were carved into the chains. One was etched so deep the link snapped, but no one replaced them. They left the gap. The next child to vanish did so silently. Her name was Mireille, 8 years old. She had told a sister just days before, "The well gave me something. I have to give it back." When she disappeared, her journal was left open. No handwriting, just an ink spiral drawn perfectly over 5 pages. Underneath, one faint line in pencil. It never forgets the ones who speak. That journal still exists, stored under restricted archive. The ink hasn't faded, but the spiral keeps widening, as though the line stretched just slightly each year. There was no announcement when the sisters stopped using the rear courtyard. No formal change to the daily routine, but morning walks no longer passed the east slope. Children were discouraged from facing the windows at night. One sister reportedly began sleeping with cotton in her ears. Another, Sister Agnes, left her habit folded on her bed, along with a note. I confessed everything. It still spoke. She was found wandering the woods, scratched, barefoot, murmuring prayers she never knew. She lived 6 more years in the sanatorium, never spoke in her own voice again. The 5th child to vanish was Eli. No note, no journal, no sound. He simply wasn't there one morning, his bedding undisturbed, his shoes tucked beneath the frame. His final prayer log, entry marked with a thumbprint instead of a name. On the windowsill, a rosary with no crucifix, tied into a noose. After that, the chapel stopped using candlelight during evening prayer. The flames were said to flicker too often, like something was breathing on them from below. The children began folding their hands differently. Not fingers lace, but palms flat. One sister asked why. A boy replied, "It's said this way, it can't get in." He never explained what it was. But the next week, he cut his palms on a window latch and bled over the prayer kneeler. When they scrubbed the stain, it turned black. Not red, not brown, black. The well was left untouched. But some say, on especially still nights, you could hear beads drop, one by one. No wind, no breath, just the slow clatter of something counting. And sometimes, when the moon angled just right, the shadow of the chain would stretch too far, past the stones, past the slats, like something beneath was tugging, not to get out, but to pray again. There was no wind, no lightning, no call to prayer. And yet, on the night of October 14th, 1921, every bell in the oratorium Rosary began to ring, 32 times. Witnesses described it not as a chime, but a compulsion, a pattern, not rhythmic, but deliberate, like a litany of names being spoken aloud in metal. There were 31 children in residence that fall, and 1 priest. His name was Father Corentin Vale, newly assigned, young, still unsure of his footing in matters of spiritual order. He recorded the incident in his private ledger with 6 words. The bells rang without chains, because he had checked. All of them. The tower was untouched, the pull cords motionless, the bells inside the chapel unmoved, and yet their sound, 32 peals in succession had filled the air like incense. He ordered the children to remain in their dormitories. He barred the doors himself. And then he stood alone in the nave, arms outstretched, crucifix in hand, waiting. But nothing came, only the echoes of the final toll. He would later admit he had counted them aloud. Each one struck a different pressure in the skull. He likened it to feeling your name spoken backward, from inside your own thoughts. At sunrise, he opened the dormitories. All 31 children were safe, but not untouched. 6 of them reported the same sensation, waking from a dreamless sleep with damp skin and ache behind the ears, and the taste of old coins on their tongues. Beneath each of their pillows was a rosary, not their own. Each one was unfamiliar, cold in the sheets, soaked as if pulled from water. The crucifixes were mismatched, the beads stained. One was strung on hair. Of the 6 children, only one spoke clearly, a boy named Henri. He had been carving a new set of rosary beads in the days before, his 3rd attempt, as required after losing his first 2. In the morning, he held up the wet rosary and whispered, "We didn't make these." A sister examined his own project, still incomplete, still in his drawer, untouched. When she asked how he knew the rosary wasn't his, he turned pale and said, "It already knows my prayers." Each of the 6 was questioned. None had heard the bells. None had woken during the night. But all 6 had identical markings on their palms. Faint indentations, like something had been tightly clenched while they slept. Only one child, Lucille, age 9, drew what she remembered. A single image, a bell with no clapper. Instead, inside, a mouth, open, whispering. Father Corentin took the rosaries and sealed them in a cedar reliquary, which he placed beneath the altar. He conducted a mass of silence, a rite rarely invoked, during which he read no scripture and spoke no words, only stood, breathing, while the children sat still. In the margins of his sermon notes, he wrote, "I offered no benediction. It offered none either." That evening, Lucille fell ill. She began sleep-speaking, reciting rosary prayers in reverse, not merely backward, but spoken as if unraveling time. The Hail Mary began with Amen and ended in silence. One sister, listening too closely, began bleeding from her left ear. Lucille's fever broke after 3 days, but her voice never fully returned. She spoke only when asked direct questions, and only in fragments. She drew again, this time 32 bells, arranged in a circle, each one ringing toward the center. And at the center, no image, only the words, "He listens backward." By the week's end, 2 more rosaries were found, tucked beneath floorboards in the chapel stairwell. These were dry, but the beads were cracked. Inside the cracks, salt. The priest contacted the archdiocese, requesting a reassignment and official exorcism of the grounds. His letter was returned unopened, marked, "No further action required. Blessings withheld." On his final night at Sacred Heart, Father Corentin recorded one last entry. "They asked me why the bells stopped. I told them the truth. They didn't stop. They were answered." He left before dawn, but the reliquary was never removed. In 1956, during a renovation, a mason discovered the box beneath a cracked floor tile. Inside, 6 rosaries. Still wet, still cold, though sealed tight. Mold had grown along the corners. Not green, not black, red, like dried blood. When reopened again in 1992 by archivists cataloging the chapel's history, a 7th rosary had appeared. No one could account for its presence. No new children had been added to the 1921 register. And yet, the bell tolls had always been counted at 32. One archivist, a lapsed seminarian, took the 7th rosary home. He left the church 3 months later and was found drowned in his bathtub, kneeling with hands clasped, a rosary wrapped around his throat. It was never recovered. And to this day, during anniversaries of the tolling, visitors sometimes report a faint sound from the chapel's rafters. Not the clang of bells, but the breath between them, like something waiting for the next name. Not to call it, but to be called back. Chapter 6, Sealed in Prayer. Word count, 296. By the spring of 1922, the Oratorium Rosy, the Rosary Room, was sealed. No procession, no blessing, no explanation. The children were moved without ceremony to the south wing, their belongings packed hastily into linen satchels. The rosary-making lesson ceased, and no one was allowed to retrieve the unfinished beads they had left behind. The door was locked, then bricked over. Only Sister Dominica would later speak of that day, in a confession recorded to tape in 1969. Her voice trembles in the first minutes, then steadies, not with peace, but with resignation. It wasn't a room, she said. It was what the children left behind in it, and what answered. A Vatican envoy arrived 2 weeks after sealing. His name was Monsignor Emilio Vaccaro, a doctrinal observer dispatched under the authority of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He was not there to minister. He was there to classify. He conducted no public mass. He spoke only with the senior sisters, and only in private. The children were forbidden from approaching him. According to internal records, Monsignor Vaccaro spent precisely 1 hour inside the chapel, 38 minutes reviewing the ledgers from the Oratorium Rosy, and only 6 minutes standing before the sealed wall itself. The remaining 3 minutes were spent in stillness. One sister later recounted that the Monsignor removed his clerical collar before entering the room, and when he emerged, he held something wrapped in cloth, a rosary, larger than standard issue, its cross visibly scorched. He did not explain what he had taken, nor why, but that evening, a note was found tucked inside his missal. They bound something in devotion, but it breathed through beadwork. The following morning, he departed without saying goodbye. He left no final sermon, no written report. Only a small iron key left on the altar, wrapped in a slip of parchment marked, "Do not unpray." That phrase was never explained. Not then, not later. The bricked-up entrance to the Oratorium Rosy was reinforced a second time with oak slats and sealed with wax stamped in the sigil of St. Dimna, patroness of the mentally afflicted. A subtle insult, some said. A quiet acknowledgement, said others, but none dare reopen it. That winter, a cold snap struck Sacred Heart with unusual severity. Pipes froze, floorboards cracked, and from behind the sealed wall, several sisters reported hearing a familiar sound, the faint click of rosary beads, not in rhythm, not prayerful, just movement, sliding across stone, stopping, then beginning again. When the children were questioned, most said they heard nothing, but one, Anna Marie, a quiet girl with thin wrists and a nervous smile, began tying knots in her bedsheets. When asked why, she whispered, "So my fingers don't forget how." A sister, disturbed, confiscated the knots, but found that they came undone on their own overnight, no matter how tightly they were bound. After the 5th night, the fabric no longer held creases. Anna Marie was moved to the infirmary for observation. She refused to speak, but she did hum the melody, the same tone the bells had rung in the year prior. 32 notes, repeated in sequence, low to high, then back again. In the chapel's upper choir loft, organ pipes once thought damaged began to emit low harmonic tones. Despite no air being pushed through them, the sound was dull, soft, almost sympathetic, as if echoing something not yet voiced. One sister described it as, like hearing your own heartbeat recited by another mouth. When the staff reviewed older records from the Rosary Room, they found something previously overlooked. A small list, handwritten and misfiled among baptismal confirmations. It listed the names of 31 children. Beside each, a word written in red ink, "Made." And beneath the list, 2 final entries, one without a name, just a mark, empty set. Beside it, unfinished. And below that, unmade, but listening. The handwriting did not match any known staff member. Following this discovery, Sister Dominica, by then the longest-serving sister at Sacred Heart, petitioned the Archdiocese for permission to sanctify the sealed room once more, not to reopen it, but to ensure that whatever resided within had not found its way out. Her request was denied, the reason cited: no anomaly of spiritual nature currently recognized. She responded with a private mass. Just herself. Just her voice. Witnesses say she stood in front of the sealed door with her original rosary, the same she had made in 1904, and recited the Ave Maria 41 times. Not 31. Not 32. 41. When asked why, she reportedly replied, "There are prayers we give, and prayers we owe." She died the following month. Her rosary was found looped 7 times around her wrist, knotted tight. Even in death, her fingers were curled inward, index and thumb pressed together, as if still counting the beads. In the decades that followed, no formal inquiry was ever held. The rosary room remained sealed, but the children remembered, in drawings, in whispered prayers with unfamiliar cadence, in dreams of halls that bent in impossible ways. Curved corridors filled with hands, each holding a single bead. No thread, no cross, just a bead, and always the same message. It isn't prayer if it never ends. Today, beneath layers of paint and plaster, the faint outline of the sealed doorway remains visible. The bricks hold. The wood does not creak. But once each year, always on the same night, the hallway grows colder than the rest of the building, and somewhere inside the wall, a dry rattle, like beads being counted. Not forward, not backward, just counted by something that learned how to pray by listening, and now waits to be heard. Chapter 7, The Archivist's Mistake. Word count, 296. In 1974, the Archdiocese of Solara commissioned a quiet audit of Sacred Heart Asylum. Not a full inspection, not an investigation, just documentation. The woman assigned to this task was not a priest nor a nun. She was an archivist. Her name was Margaret Eloise Hill, 37 years old, former university historian, quiet, detail-oriented, and by all accounts, not easily rattled. She arrived in late October with 2 crates of materials, parchment paper, graphite pencils, carbon duplicates, a small reel-to-reel recorder, and a collection of folding maps of the original 1898 layout. None of the sisters residing at Sacred Heart then had been present in its earlier years. Most were new placements. Only one, Sister Agnes, seemed hesitant about the audit. Some rooms were hidden, she told Margaret on the second day, but not from shame, from mercy. Margaret recorded that quote and continued. She began her work in the chapel nave, charting elevations and transcribing liturgical plaques. From there, she documented the dormitories, the infirmary, and the east and west wings. She labeled everything with neutral descriptors. Room 3A, minor corrosion on hinges. Passage 2E, floor slopes 4 degrees downward, possible water damage. But her interest grew markedly when she discovered several false walls, sealed entrances unmarked on any official blueprint. One in particular drew her focus. Behind a plaster panel in the east hallway, directly across from the sealed oratorium Rosary, she uncovered an abandoned ventilation shaft. The shaft was narrow, too small to crawl through, but inside, caught in the grating, she found something curious. A rosary, handmade. Its cord was stiff with age. Its cross was missing, and its beads were bone. She did not recognize the material at first. She assumed ceramic, maybe ivory, but later that evening, she attempted to boil them for cleaning. The water turned pink, then dark. The bones floated, not all at once, but bead by bead, as if surfacing in sequence, as if counting. Margaret recorded a note on this, dated November 3rd, 1974. Recovered rosary, material organic, possibly phalangeal. Note, faint indentation on some beads. Bite marks. She took photographs, but only one developed clearly. The rest came out fogged or fragmented, burnt around the edges, as if overexposed despite proper handling. She returned the next day to remeasure the shaft, but the rosary was no longer where she left it. In its place, dust and a single tooth, small, worn smooth. She did not leave Sacred Heart. Instead, she requested access to sub-basement blueprints, those marked archived and non-functional. The sisters reluctantly agreed, and that's when the notes changed. Her transcriptions, once clinical, became emotional, erratic, even. Margins once used for measurements now held strange scrawls. Sentences like, "The air moves like a throat. Prayer shouldn't echo if no one else is speaking. I counted 31 again. I know it was 29. On November 9th, she began writing on both sides of her pages, a forbidden practice in archival work. Some phrases repeated dozens of times. It was never well. It was never well. It was never. The final entry, unfinished and in fading pencil, reads, "It wasn't a well, it was a mouth." That's where the record ends. Margaret Eloise Hill vanished the next morning. No signs of forced entry. No signs of departure. Her bags remained packed. Her tape recorder, untouched, still had tape spooled and ready. Her final photograph, taken from the inside of the shaft looking out, showed the hallway in grainy detail, but reflected faintly in the brass grill was her face, mouth open, eyes closed, and behind her, a shadow with fingers stretched long, not outward, but inward, reaching into her chest. The photograph was sealed in diocesan archives. Official cause of disappearance, unknown. Her supervisor filed a formal complaint that her behavior had become troubled, citing delusional associations with undocumented materials. But some sisters remember what happened after. That same week, one of the chapel bells began ringing, not fully, but with a soft, clacking tremor, as if something were caught inside its bronze throat. When inspected, they found nothing, only a strand of blackened cord, tied in 5 loose knots. Still warm, children at the nearby convent school began drawing pictures, not of the chapel, not of the sisters, but of a shape underground. It was always drawn the same way, a long vertical tunnel, with teeth. Above it, stick figures. Below it, rosaries. And beside it, a woman with no mouth. When asked who she was, one child whispered. She listened so it doesn't have to. Years later, when construction crews attempted to restore the east wing, they found that one of the old vents no longer led to any passage. Instead, the shaft opened into compact soil, tamped down hard, as if pressed from inside. The bone rosary was never recovered, but every now and then, a draft carries through the east corridor, and with it, the scent of wet parchment, and something else. Not rot, not decay, but breath, like something just beneath the wall, exhaling through beads, and somewhere, perhaps still echoing down a vent that should no longer exist. A prayer that does not belong to any liturgy. A woman's voice, repeating something unfinished. It wasn't a well. It wasn't a well. It wasn't. The sentence ends, but the voice does not. In September 2019, a restoration initiative funded by the Archdiocese of Solara set its sights on Sacred Heart Asylum's Eastern Chapel Wing. Its goals were simple: stabilize the old structure, reopen the site as a historical museum, and dispel the lingering rumors that had haunted the grounds for over a century. The team in charge was not ecclesiastical. It was secular, private contractors, engineers, a few preservation experts. They brought ground-penetrating radar, drone-mounted LiDAR scanners, and portable thermal equipment. What they expected to find were waterlogged foundations, root structures, and wall subsidence. What they found was a cavity, not large, roughly 5 feet in diameter, spherical, seated just behind the east chapel wall, but unnatural. The radar showed it as perfectly clean. No sediment, no tree roots, no mineral disruption, just absence. The crew chief, Marla Wren, noted in her log. We assumed it was a sinkhole, but there's no evidence of earth movement. It's as if something pressed it into the ground from above, then disappeared. The cavity had no visible entrance, but adjacent to it, behind a long-forgotten altar base, they found what looked like stonework, arched, covered in calcified soot. Marla's team spent 3 days chipping away at the surrounding plaster. Behind it, iron rings. 3 of them, rust-choked, bolted into stone. Looped through each ring was a chain, and bound around the chains, dozens of strips of faded linen. most too brittle to unfold. But one cloth, when brushed clean, revealed a symbol stitched in red thread, a loop cross surrounded by 13 dots. Not Catholic, not Roman, not documented. As they worked, one of the assistants, Jay Corwin, reported a high-pitched static in his headset. He removed the earpiece, thinking it was interference, but the sound continued, even without power. He described it later as, like someone humming a song they didn't want you to hear. By the fifth day, they had exposed the entrance to the cavity, a narrow shaft descending into packed soil. At its base, stone, circular, and hollow, a well, but this well had no rope, no bucket, no pulley. Instead, it was sealed, encircled by metal wire and more cloth, and pressed into its center, where a crank might once have been, was a mass of knotted cords, 32 rosaries. Each was hand-tied, each unique, and all woven together into one choking braid, twisting upward like a noose of prayer. Some beads were wooden, others stone. One was carved from something black and fibrous, later identified as hair resin, and one, just one, appeared to be glass, but held a faint red hue that deepened in direct light. They placed a rosary braid on a clean cloth for examination, but when uncoiled it resisted, not like it was stiff, but like it wanted to stay wrapped. The team lead filmed this process. It was par protocol, document every step. The footage shows Marla reaching to touch the central knot. At that moment, the camera audio warbles, the frame blurs, and something speaks. A woman's voice, cracked, hollow but calm, as if remembering, not confessing. They called it prayer, but I remember screaming. Then the footage cuts to black. Not a glitch, a shutdown. The camera was later recovered intact, but the battery was melted from the inside. The metal casing warped, as if something heated it from thought. No one could explain the voice. No one in the room claimed to have spoken. Jay Corwin, whose headset had earlier buzzed, began trembling when he heard it replayed. "That's the voice," he whispered. "That's what I heard when I slept too close to the wall." His logbook, normally filled with numbers and timestamps, contained a strange note on the following page. The mouth stayed open. We just forgot how to hear it. The excavation was halted. Temporarily, they said. The rosary braid was boxed, sealed, and sent to a diocesan preservation lab. But when the courier arrived, the box was empty. No signs of tampering. No break in the chain of custody. Just absence. Again. After that, the chapel's east wing was locked, reclassified as unstable. But reports continued. Visitors claimed to hear knocking from beneath the floor. 3 knocks, then silence. Some said they found cloth scraps near the pews. Always stained, always knotted, always damp. A nun who once served at Sacred Heart returned out of curiosity. She entered the east hallway alone and emerged weeping, holding her old rosary, one she had lost decades earlier. It was burned at both ends, and missing the cross. She claimed she heard children praying beneath her feet, but not to God, with something. When asked what that meant, she said, their prayers ended too neatly, as if they weren't speaking from hope, but from memory. Later surveys of the cavity returned nothing. The well was gone, filled in, or closed, but thermal scans showed something else. A heat bloom, faint but real, like breath lingering in cold stone, coming not from the shaft itself, but from the chains once bolted around it. Heat that pulsed, in patterns. Some said it resembled Morse code. Others said it was like counting. 32 pulses, then stillness, then 32 again. No more, no less. One Vatican archivist, upon reviewing the footage and scan reports, left a single note. Not a prison, not a tomb, a liturgy bound in fear, and something was listening. The footage from that day remained sealed, stored in a lead-lined cabinet beneath the Archdiocese Historical Preservation Office. It is unlabeled, but those who've handled it claim the case is warm, and that, on quiet nights, it hums, softly, not in a tone, but in a breath, as if someone or something is still kneeling behind a wall that was never built, hands wrapped in rosary cords that were never blessed, mouthing prayers that never reached heaven, because the well was never for water. It was for holding something that could speak back, and it remembers every word. By October 2019, the restoration efforts at Sacred Heart Asylum had all but ceased. The east wing was shuttered, the excavation site had been sealed, and the team, once composed of 32 workers, was down to 11, not due to injury, not even resignation, just withdrawal. One by one, they stopped returning to the site. No formal notice, no confrontation, just a kind of quiet unraveling, like a prayer no one wanted to finish. What remained were fragments, photos, thermal prints, a handful of recorded testimonies, and a table pushed to the edge of the chapel nave where the light never fully reached. Upon that table were 7 objects, each carefully numbered, each stored in a velvet-lined case. 7 rosaries, but not one bore the symbol of Christ. Instead of crucifixes, each strand ended in a loop. No hook, no clasp, just a closed, tightening knot, the kind you would pull around a wrist or a throat. Marla Wren, the restoration lead, noted they weren't made for prayer. They were made to hold something, or someone. Forensic analysis began in late October, carried out by the Archdiocesan Historical Forensics Division. Each rosary was handled under observation, with gloves and lead shielding, not for sanctity, but because one of the beads moved. Of the 7, 1 was strung with volcanic glass, each bead marked with shallow ridges, like they'd been scraped with fingernails. Another was carved from bone, dyed red. Tests confirmed it was an animal, but 3 stood out. The first, a rosary made entirely from braided hair, coarse, black, and tightly twisted. Knotted between the strands were minute scraps of cloth. Microscopic analysis revealed Latin stitching in faded red ink. A partial phrase, Dormieni osculum eni redas. Do not return the kiss to the sleeping one. The second, a strand of ash-colored beads. Not wood, not ceramic, but compressed soot pressed in fire with resin. On one side of each bead, faintly engraved, the Ave Maria. On the other, no mark, except when held under infrared. Then, the backside revealed tiny impressions, fingerprints, pressed into the ash before it hardened, child-sized, and many. The third, a rosary that contained what appeared to be an amber bead. It pulsed faintly. No electrical components, no batteries, just a rhythm, like breath trapped in stone. One investigator described it as a heartbeat that isn't trying to stay alive, just to be remembered. They tried removing the bead under controlled conditions. The moment it left the asylum grounds, it dimmed, not slowly, instantly, as if the beat was never its own, but borrowed from the place it came from. The bead was returned, and without any handling, it resumed its pulse, slightly faster. After that, they didn't move it again. Documentation records showed that several clergy observers voiced concerns about the artifacts. Father Ellery, attached to the Vatican's Office of Counter-Ritual Artifacts, wrote, "These are not devotional items. They are restraints, designed to imitate prayer, to trap something within ritual, not expel it, not sanctify it, just lull it." He requested an immediate quarantine of the chapel site, but before action could be taken, his report was sealed, and he disappeared, not vanished, just reassigned to an undisclosed monastery for spiritual recalibration. A week later, the chapel received an unmarked envelope, no return address, no postage. Inside, a photograph. It showed a rosary made from paper ash, tied in a loop around a small, cracked statue of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music, etched in dust across her face. We prayed loud enough. It listened. The message was dismissed as a prank, but when archivists examined the photograph, they noticed something else. The statue in the photo had been broken since 1913, stored in the sub-basement, never repaired, never displayed, yet the photo showed it whole. And worse, behind it, Barely visible was the outline of a well, bound in chains. There was no record of anyone accessing the storage archive that year, and no camera had been placed near the original statue since 2006. Marla Wren began experiencing auditory hallucinations shortly after reviewing the image. Not voices, just the sound of beads falling, one at a time, onto wood. Her personal journal, recovered months later, ends with a final, clipped entry. We tied them to prayer, but not the way we tie hope. We tied them down, with intention, and something learned to slip the cross. The Vatican quietly classified the case. All artifacts were relocated to the Archive Sanctum under Rome, only to remain accessible for observation under 24-hour surveillance. And the pulsing bead? It stopped on the feast day of the Immaculate Conception, December 8th, at precisely midnight. Not gradually, not softly. It cracked. A single fracture running through the center. Inside, nothing. No filament, no core, just air, and the smell of burning cloth, and something faintly sweet, like breath held too long. To this day, no known rosary from Sacred Heart bears a crucifix. Only loops, only knots, only things that close tighter when pulled. And in the silence between each bead, if you place it to your ear, they say you can still hear not a prayer, but the sound of something that was taught to kneel, not in reverence, but in warning. The final footage from Sacred Heart Asylum was dated February 2nd, 2020. A cold day, unremarkable weather, no wind, no storm, only an overcast stillness that hung like fog across the chapel's upper ridge. The restoration team had been reduced to 6. No contractors, no press, just internal archivists from the Diocesan Preservation Office, tasked with cataloging the site for final closure. That day, they focused on the excavation chamber beneath the east wall, where the well had been uncovered. The chains were still there, rusted, slack, but strangely warm to the touch. The cloths, once tied in prayer knot around the well's rim, had begun to fray. Their writing, though faded, still bore the same looped Latin inscription seen in the Rosaries. Oculi manet, manus non dimittant. The eyes remain, the hands do not release. A small camera was positioned 3 feet from the well, set to record continuously. Nothing unusual was expected. No movement, no sound. But at 3:17 p.m., the image shifted. Not a glitch, not interference. Just a subtle warping at the frame's edge, like something breathing through the lens. A man named Anton Reyes, assistant archivist, previously uninvolved in field operations, entered frame. He was not scheduled to be near the well. His task was to log cloth samples from the south wing. But there he was, standing, then kneeling, facing the well, his hands in his lap, his lips moving. There was no sound. The other team members noticed only when he failed to respond to radio checks. When they arrived, he was still kneeling, still mouthing words, eyes unfocused. They asked what he was doing. He didn't answer, just stared into the center of the well. Only hours later, when removed from the site and brought to an off-site clinic, did he finally speak. His voice was hoarse, his pupils dilated, but he answered one question. "Anton, what were you praying?" He blinked and said, slowly, "It wasn't mine. I just remembered it." He was admitted for observation. He has not spoken since. The footage was reviewed repeatedly, enhanced, stabilized, filtered for subharmonics. At 3 hours, 18 minutes, and 22 seconds, the audio, previously silent, registered something. Not speech, not a voice, just the sound of beads, 32 of them, falling, one by one, onto stone. No rosary was ever found in the chamber, but the floor beneath the well had marks, circular, concentric impressions, as if something had been spun there, tightly, ritually, like a rosary dragged in circles. Over and over, the Vatican declared Sacred Heart officially sealed on March 1st, 2020. The chains were reforged and the chamber collapsed with sacred concrete. A new plaque was installed at the chapel's entrance. Celeri Tiorate. Be silent and pray. No team has returned since. The property was sold, but no development followed. Locals now call the surrounding forest Silent Mercy, and hikers still pass through it, usually unaware. But reports began within months. Some say they hear chains, not from the ground, not from the chapel, but from the trees. Metal swaying, not clanging, just shifting, like something once bound has moved. Slightly, others describe whispers, always faint, always rhythmic. But it's not words they hear. It's numbers, 32 of them, counted in breath, drawn out, deliberate. One hiker, a woman named Ava Ing, who passed the edge of the forest on the last Sunday of Lent, described it best. I thought I heard children playing. You know how they count when they hide? But this was different, slower, like they weren't hiding, like they were waiting to be found. When shown a photo of the Sacred Heart site, she refused to look again, simply saying, "It knows when you listen too closely." One final anomaly remains. The well chamber, though sealed, was recently re-examined via satellite ground scan in mid-2024. The readings show a hollow space, still intact, still untouched, but deeper now, 3 meters deeper than it had been in 2020. The chamber wasn't filled. It simply descended, as if the earth gave way, or something pulled it downward. The report was inconclusive and ignored. But those who listened to full recording, especially the moments before Anton Reyes kneels, note one final sound, a whisper, heard not from the well, but above the camera mic. "Close. Breath warm," it said calmly. "He prays now, so we do not need to." Then the counting began. 1, 2, 3, and stopped at 32. Every time. To this day, hikers who stray too close to the sealed chapel sometimes return wearing rosaries, ones they never packed, knotted, looped, without a crucifix. When asked where they got them, they often say the same thing: "I just found it on the path. It looked like someone was waiting for me to pick it up." And if you place it to your ear, quietly alone, you may still hear the prayer, not ending, never ending, just remembered, again and again and again. There's power in faith, but there's danger in repetition. Prayer, like ritual, can remember things better left buried. Some places hold prayers that were never answered. Others hold the ones that were. And behind Sacred Heart Asylum, something still waits, counting rosaries in the dark,